From Public Radio International, I'm Hari Sreenivasan, and this is America Abroad.
And I'm Donna McElligott with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. This is Alberta at Noon.
Today, our programs have joined forces for the Keystone XL Pipeline, an international town hall. We've brought together two live audiences, one here in the U.S. at the studios of NET Nebraska in Lincoln, and the other at the CBC in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Hello, Nebraska, and hello, Alberta.
We are live streaming this event on the web, so join the online conversation on Twitter. The hashtag we are using this evening is hashtag KXL Town Hall, and we hope to hear from those on the web as this program progresses.
So, listeners, if you don't know, there's already one Keystone pipeline that runs from Canada to Texas. But the Keystone XL, the last phase, is an added pipeline aimed to increase the amount of oil that could be transported, almost 1,200 miles from Alberta, Canada, through Montana, past the Bakken oil fields to Steelhead, Nebraska. It would connect with existing pipelines to take the oil to Texas refineries on the Gulf of Mexico. This last phase of the pipeline has been the subject of much controversy, both here in Nebraska and nationwide. Although a Pew poll last year indicates that 65% of Americans support the pipeline, the controversy has delayed the pipeline's completion. Here's President Obama speaking in June of 2013 on the subject.
And our national interest will be served only if this project does not significantly exacerbate the problem of carbon pollution. The net effects of the pipeline's impact on our climate will be absolutely critical to determining whether this project is allowed to go forward.
President Obama is expected to make some sort of decision after the U.S. midterm elections on whether to approve the pipeline. But until then, we're going to hear from the people who live closest to it on why or why not it should be built.
And Hari, here in Alberta, oil producers are wondering why the decision is taking so long. The Prime Minister himself, Stephen Harper, who is a proponent of Keystone XL, has called approval of the project a no-brainer. But just so people in the U.S. know, Keystone XL is just part of a larger energy debate that's taking place around this province, and much of that debate centers on the development of the Alberta oil sands.
And Donna, just for the record and for this audience, what are oil sands?
Well, simply put, the oil sands is, as the phrase suggests, a mixture of oil, sand, and clay. It's also called bitumen, and it is plentiful in the northern parts of Alberta. There are three main areas for oil sands extraction: the Athabasca, Peace River, and the Cold Lake area. And further to south in the province, you will see the city of Calgary, and that is where most of the energy industry is centered, including TransCanada, the company behind Keystone.
All right, thanks, Donna. We'll be hearing from audiences here in Nebraska and Alberta in a moment. But first, I'd like to do a lightning round of statements from our guests. Joining me here on stage in Lincoln is Ken Winston. He is the policy advocate for the Nebraska Sierra Club, who works to educate the public about the effects of climate change and the environmental dangers of coal and oil extraction. So, Ken, in roughly 30 seconds or so, why are you opposed to the building of this pipeline?
Well, this is one of these things where I don't know if I can do it in 30 seconds.
Try.
I could do 30 minutes. And I think, looking out in the audience, I see a lot of people who could make a better explanation of why the pipeline's a bad idea. But there are threats. First of all, there's the tar sands process, which kills every living thing in its path. There's the impact on climate change, which President Obama talked about. It definitely will exacerbate the problem of climate change. There are threats to our aquifer. We are home to the North America's largest aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer, and water is much more valuable than oil. And finally, threats to our rights and the rights of humans, Native Americans, and the fundamental American rights. And as I indicated, looking out in the audience, I see many people who could elaborate far better than I on all of these subjects.
Okay, we'll give them a chance. I also want to give a chance now to John Keene. He's a veterinarian, he's an academic, and he's running uncontested for state senate, an elected member of the Southern Public Power District Board of Directors. It's a publicly owned power utility in Nebraska that believes that the pipeline will help lower costs to its ratepayers. So, John, here's your 30 seconds. Why do you support the pipeline?
I certainly support the Keystone XL Pipeline and its development for a number of reasons. We've seen an exhaustive 5-year process which demonstrates that we have a well-studied, well-planned, safe infrastructure project that is shovel-ready and ready to begin within the state of Nebraska. It brings forth a number of important economic opportunities for economic development, both at the local, state, and national level. It enhances and increases our North American energy security and independence. And it also sends a proactive signal when we talk about some of the controversies and issues surrounding whether it's a siting issue or how we approach large-scale infrastructure projects, that Nebraska is a community which will work together ultimately as a community to do that which is in the best interest of all of its residents.
All right, thanks, John. Donna, tell us about your guests.
Well, I have two guests on stage with me here, and I'm going to go first to Corey Goulet, who's on my immediate left, and Corey is the president of Keystone Projects for TransCanada. Corey, we just heard from Nebraska. Tell us, from your point of view, why you think this pipeline needs to be built.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank America Abroad and the CBC for hosting this event. I think it's important to continue the dialogue on Keystone XL. And, you know, Canada and the U.S. are great trading partners, and we've had a long history in that regard. I think Keystone XL embodies that trading relationship that we've had for many years. And the advantages are manifold, but the three primary advantages are the economic benefits that it brings to the regions where it runs, both in terms of jobs, but also taxes and economic stimulus. Secondly, this is a safe pipeline. I know John mentioned that, but this pipeline has been studied for 6 years now. There's over 17,000 pages of study, and we know that it has a minimal impact to the environment and won't increase greenhouse gases very much at all. And then finally, this pipeline is supplying energy that's needed by North America. You know, the U.S. uses some 15 million barrels a day of crude oil, and will use and has to import a significant amount of that. And studies indicate that up to 2035, they'll have to import as much as 7.5 million barrels a day. This is a pipeline that will provide North American crude from the Bakken and from the oil sands to the Gulf Coast refineries where it's used.
Thank you, Corey. And we'll hear more of your viewpoint throughout the night. But next to my guest, Corey Goulet, is Andrew Leach. And Andrew is the Enbridge Professor of Energy Policy at the University of Alberta. And just a little disclosure here, Hari, Andrew's position is partly sponsored by another pipeline company. Andrew does not receive funds directly from Enbridge, and we think that he should be judged by his opinions, and you can check out details at andrewleach.ca where he blogs. His opinions are his own and sometimes quite critical of energy policy on behalf of the government as well as the oil industry. Andrew, much has been made about the pipeline and the fact that it will carry product from the Alberta oil sands. What do you think of Keystone XL?
Well, I've been looking at Keystone XL for years now, as many of us have, and what's been very interesting about this pipeline is how it's forced us to think about various aspects of the energy industry that we haven't thought much about before. Probably the key one in Canada and in the U.S., but particularly in Canada, is reconciling oil sands development with climate change. And we saw President Obama's Georgetown speech on the coverage already, or heard from it. And I think from that moment forward, that really changed the discussion. And we saw that in the debate here of going from, well, we need this pipeline to get the oil sands out of the ground, to essentially the oil sands are coming out of the ground anyway, this pipeline doesn't matter very much. The debate turned on its head. The second reason why I think this has forced us to think about how we handle energy infrastructure is we've talked about the benefits of building this pipeline largely in terms of the costs of building it, the jobs it would take to build it, the resources, the taxes, all of these things. Whereas pipelines are really about getting product efficiently to market from a seller to a buyer in a way that minimizes those costs. I've facetiously joked on a number of occasions, if we wanted to create jobs transporting oil, we'd move it by bucket brigade, not by pipeline.
Thank you, Andrew. Hari?
All right, so I'd like to bring the audiences into the conversation a little bit here too, but I need to add a note here. I'm going to be using the term oil sands, not tar sands, to be consistent with the CBC's editorial policy. So, Donna, I'd like to put a question out to your audience there in Calgary. What have the oil sands meant to the people in the province in terms of jobs or standard of living?
All right, Tracy has the microphone here, and hands up from the audience. Who would like to respond to that? Why don't I go to Deborah Yedlin, who is a columnist with the Calgary Herald and a commentator on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's CBC Morning Show. Deborah?
Good evening. I would like to when you talk about the benefits that accrue to the province, first of all, Alberta is basically, because of the oil sands, is the economic engine of this country. And we've seen a huge influx in terms of the number of people that have come into Alberta to live here and work here. The government obviously benefits from the royalties, from the tax revenues that goes to fund social programs, infrastructure, education, healthcare. And so from a standard of living perspective, Albertans have definitely benefited from energy activity. The other thing people really don't realize is that it really is one big science lab, because there's continuous improvement in terms of how the extraction process is undertaken. The energy sector itself is always looking at ways to make things better. Yes, make them cheaper, get it cheaper out of the ground, but also to look at ways at minimizing the environmental impact. And I think people miss that part of it. This is a huge science lab. There's a lot of interesting scientific experiments that are going on related to exploration and production of the oil sands.
Thank you, Deborah. And if you could pass the microphone to your neighbor, Andrew Nikiforuk, who's a best-selling author in Canada of several books, one on the oil sands, which he calls tar sands. Andrew, what have the oil sands, or from your perspective, the tar sands, meant to people here in this province?
Well, they mean a lot of different things. And I think, Deborah has focused on some of the economic benefits, but there have been a lot of political and social drawbacks from the kind of rapid development that we've seen in this province. Peter Lougheed, many years ago, laid out 5 conditions for reasonable resource development. Behave like an owner, collect your fair share, save for the rainy day, add value to the resource, clean up the mess. And we have failed on all those counts.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And Hari, we would like to put a question to your audience there in Nebraska. And it's about the number of pipelines that are already running through your state. Why is the KXL stirring up so much controversy despite the fact there are so many other pipelines? Okay, who in Nebraska? Come on, Team Nebraska. Let's represent. Just step up right to the mic here and go ahead and identify yourself. I mean, also the point of us getting our two audiences together is so that you can hear and interact with each other, not just the experts. I know it's completely scintillating to watch radio be made, but we really want you to hear how other people are thinking. Perhaps they're similar to you, perhaps they're not. But sir, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Randy Thompson, Nebraska cattleman, and opponent to the Keystone XL Pipeline for many reasons. And the question was, what now?
The question she asked was, there are already a number of pipelines running through the state. Why is this one so controversial?
Well, first of all, we've heard this argument over and over again, but I can guarantee you there are no other pipelines in the Sandhills in Nebraska that would come anywhere close to being the magnitude of the Keystone XL. Nothing close.
And what do you mean by magnitude? Let's say I'm listening.
Okay, this is a massive pipeline. It's 30,
you can leave the microphone down. It's picking up your sound.
36 inches in diameter, and it's full of toxic chemicals along with tar sands, and it's pumping at like 1,300 and some pounds of pressure, which would mean any type of a small leak could go directly into our water supply. And this has been a major, major concern for Nebraska farmers and ranchers.
Okay. Anybody else from Nebraska? Go ahead and stand up or stick your hand up and we can call on you. Brad Miller, I think you had sent a card in. Yeah, come on up. There's a microphone right in front of you.
Yes, I've worked pipelines, and they're the safest thing built compared to other modes of transportation. If you put it on rail cars, tanker trucks, there's always a chance of an accident. Look what happened up in Canada with the rail cars. There's been other incidents of rail cars getting loose, derailments.
Right. Just this particular question was about, well, why do you think this particular pipeline so controversial if other pipelines already exist in the state?
I don't understand why it's so controversial. It should have been built already. One's already been built. There's other pipelines through this state. Not only this state, you talk about the Ogallala Aquifer, you look at a map of Texas, Oklahoma, there's already way more pipelines in those two states than what you're talking here in Nebraska. So I can't believe it's so controversial.
Okay. It's all right. And sir, go ahead, step up. Go ahead and identify yourself.
Yes, I'm John Hansen, and I'm the president of the Nebraska Farmers Union, so I represent a lot of landowners. At the beginning of this process, the state of Nebraska did not have in place an appropriate siting and routing authority. And as the result of that lack of authority being in place for an oil pipeline, as opposed to other pipelines, TransCanada looked at the map and simply took a geographic shortcut right through the Ogallala Aquifer, and that, when folks looked at the map, understood how close the water level was to the surface and how permeable the soil was, said, why would we run a pipeline, and all pipelines do leak, right through the middle of our water supply? And so all of the data says that, in fact, that pipelines do leak. So the National Response Center data for pipeline leaks documented that 18,558 pipeline leaks were reported in the last 12 years. That's 1,546 pipeline leaks per year. So when you have a pipeline leak under that kind of pressure in the middle of your water supply for substantial portions of the year, about 100 miles of this pipeline, it'll not be a matter of how many feet to water, it'll be a matter of how many feet underwater is in fact the pipeline. So if it leaks, it's automatically in the water supply.
Okay, so John Keene, we've heard at least a couple of environmental concerns. How do you reassure those people that have these legitimate fears about what happens to their land if there's an accident?
I think certainly we have a general concern all the way across Nebraska for the quality of our water and maintaining the safety of our aquifer. So first and foremost, maintaining that safety is one of our major concerns for all parties involved. When it comes to the safety record of pipelines in general, we have to look at existing models that we have already in place and whether or not they have posed any significant threat or significant risk in their operation throughout their lifetime. We have a number of examples we can look to here in Nebraska, which transport oil through many of the same types of soils, many over the same Ogallala Aquifer, and have represented decades-old technology that has been safe and reliable for over 60 years. The Platte Pipeline going west to east across Nebraska crosses the Ogallala Aquifer, goes south of the Platte River, and has operated virtually unknown, and most Nebraskans unaware that it's been there. It's been so safe over these years. We also certainly have the example of stewardship that has been provided for us by the original Keystone Pipeline. So when we talk about a number of the safety issues about spill response, about the monitoring of the pipeline, we have an existing model using modern technology by this same company, which has demonstrated to be safe and a good steward of our land, air, and water here in Nebraska. So certainly we don't want to take our eye off of the ball when it comes to maintaining our environmental quality. The challenge becomes balancing that risk with the development of a critical piece of infrastructure that's in our national interest.
Ken, as you said, there's people in the audience that express your point of view very well. So if you have something to add?
Yeah, there's actually several things I'd like to add. One is John was just talking about how safe the first pipeline was. Well, it leaked 14 times in the first year of operation. One of them was a 500-barrel leak, which is 21,000 gallons. That's not a good safety record to have 14 leaks in the first year. And there have been huge leaks in recent times. In the last couple of years, there was a huge leak in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that cost over $1 billion to clean up and still hasn't been completely cleaned up. So there was a big leak in Mayflower, Arkansas on Easter Sunday of 2013, where oil was running down people's streets and through their backyards. And the other thing about it is that the Ogallala Aquifer and the place that TransCanada originally wanted to run it was through an area of the Sandhills where as John Hansen indicated, the depth to water was very few feet to water, and yet the aquifer extended for many feet below the surface. It's an area where there's some of the best fresh water in the world, and as I've indicated before, water is going to be our most valuable resource in the 21st century. People already are looking around the world and going, we need water. People in California, people in Texas are saying, what are we going to do for water? You can live without oil. You can't live without water. Okay.
Donna, you've heard some of these concerns?
Yes, indeed. And we have Corey Goulet, who is responsible for the Keystone XL project from TransCanada. You've heard people raise these concerns over and over again about pipeline leaks, ruptures, explosions, and of course TransCanada has issues itself, which has just been addressed. How can you possibly assure people in Nebraska that there won't be an incident or an accident with Keystone XL?
Well, first of all, I think, and John referred to it, the original base Keystone, which was completed in 2010, has safely transported 610 million barrels of crude oil, not only through Nebraska, but through many other states and provinces. The 14 leaks that Ken mentioned were in the first year of operation, but they weren't the pipeline itself. They were at our pump stations, and we have facilities to collect that oil and make sure that it doesn't get off the property. And that was cleaned up very quickly. In fact, only one leak was 400 barrels. The second largest leak was 15 barrels, and everything else was a very small leak. And those occurred out of seals, out of valves, out of equipment at the pump station. So the pipe itself has not leaked in any of these cases. Pipelines in general, I think it's been discussed already, are the safest way of transporting hydrocarbons. And in the last 10 years, the history of pipelines has improved dramatically. In the U.S., the record of pipelines is very good, and the number of incidents has been reduced by a quarter of what it was 10 years ago. In Canada, the improvement is some 60%. In addition to that, we have agreed to 59 special conditions, and those are contained in the final supplemental environmental impact statement. Conditions that involve the construction of the facility, the materials that are used for the pipeline, as well as the operation and maintenance over the long term of the service of the facilities. And those will make this the safest pipeline in America. They add a level of redundancy much above what is normal in the industry. And so that's the comfort that I can provide to those who have concerns about the Ogallala Aquifer. I could go on and talk about the Ogallala Aquifer. You probably want to hear from others.
We do. And Andrew Leach, here we are talking about pipelines, and many people are wondering why we are not talking more about renewables. Why do we continuously talk about building new pipelines and not more about renewable energy?
Well, I think we're talking, maybe using the president's term a little bit, but an all of the above energy situation where this is not an investment where you could say if tomorrow the Keystone XL pipeline were turned down, I'm going to make the pretense of speaking for you, Corey, but that money's not going to turn around and go into windmills. This is capital which is looking for a particular home. These are oil sands shippers who are looking to move their product. And in this case, the more relevant question is, what would the outcome be were this pipeline to be turned down, or if this pipeline were to be approved? Is that going to make a material difference in the amount of capital available for renewable energy projects? Probably not. Whether or not we should have policies which advance renewables to a greater degree is, I think, in large part separate from this.
Thank you. Hari?
So, Ken, you've heard some of what the gentleman from TransCanada had to say. What do you think?
Well, I guess I'd like to talk about renewable energy since Mr. Leach was talking about renewable energy. Really, Nebraska has wonderful renewable energy resources, and we're not tapping them. We've just now started to tap into our renewable energy resources. And let me just do a little bit of a comparison of what a wind farm is in comparison to a pipeline. And I have to take off my glasses to read. But a wind farm, with a wind farm, the wind company leases the land and provides annual payments to the landowners. With a pipeline, it's a one-time payment. With a wind farm, there's annual tax payments. With a pipeline, there's declining tax revenue. There have been rural communities that have been revived because of wind farms. As Mr. Goulet indicated, yes, indeed, there is a pipeline that runs through the state of Nebraska, but no community has been revived because of that pipeline. A rural community with an 800 megawatt wind farm could look at $5 million in property tax revenue for 20 years. In addition, it could create 80 permanent jobs. The pipeline, and that would be only in Nebraska only, whereas 35 jobs are projected for the pipeline nationwide. One of the other things are that there's a decommissioning requirement for a wind farm. There's no decommissioning requirement for the pipeline. Many counties could benefit all across Nebraska through wind development, but only counties on the route benefit from the pipeline. The other thing is, wind companies don't threaten landowners with eminent domain. And Pipeline and TransCanada did and has done that repeatedly. And I'm not aware of a wind company coming in and trying to pass legislation that's been declared unconstitutional, but TransCanada did just that.
All right, I want to ask a question to a member of the audience in Calgary, Ed Whittingham. He's with the Energy and Environment Research Group, the Pembina Institute. You've been listening to this conversation. Your thoughts?
Ed is right here in the front row. Ed Whittingham from the Pembina Institute.
Great, thanks, Hari. I think when you look at this pipeline and you look at the barrels per day that it will facilitate in terms of production, and what that means in terms of an issue that my institute works closely on, and that's the implications in greenhouse gas emissions. You have to put it in a little bit of historical context and in pace and scale context to understand why the concern. And when I think to the mid-90s, here in this province in Alberta, we had an oil sands task force that set a production goal out of the oil sands of 1 million barrels per day by 2020. Well, we achieved that in 2004, 16 years ahead of schedule. And I think one of the issues is our environmental management systems have been playing catch up ever since. So that's where we've come from. And currently we're at about 2.5 million barrels of production a day. When you build out, it'll take you up to 3 million. But the industry is looking to double or triple that rate of production. And if you look at what's already approved, it's going to bring us up to 6 million barrels per day. What's in the regulatory pipeline will bring you up close to 8 million. So whether it's a doubling or tripling of production, it's hard to imagine we're not going to have a commensurate increase in environmental impact, in spite of the best efforts of this science lab that we have going in the oil sands right now. And that is taking us in the opposite direction of what Canada and the United States have both committed to internationally in terms of a climate change reduction target. So it's hard to square up. You increase that production, where are those emissions decreases going to come from to allow for that while achieving our target? And right now the math simply does not add up.
All right, thanks very much, Ed Whittingham from the Pembina Institute. Hari.
Okay, we've got a question from an audience member. Barb Thompson says, my husband and I live in rural Nebraska and are dependent on well water in our home. What will TransCanada do when their pipeline bursts and fouls the homeowners, ranchers, and farmers rely on for their homes and their livestock and their crops? But not specific to her home, but I think other people might have that same question.
All right, thank you. Corey Goulet of TransCanada.
Well, obviously, prevention is the first thing that we do, and I talked a little bit about how you prevent leaks from happening in the first place. But as important, when you do have an incident, you make sure you manage it very quickly. You shut down the pipeline. We have thousands of sensors on the pipeline that pick up temperature and pressure and flow rate signals every 5 seconds, and through satellite send that to a control center. And as soon as we detect a problem, we shut it down. And that allows us to minimize the impact of any potential incident. If there is an incident, then you deal with it. It's our responsibility to clean it up. It's our responsibility to make sure that the problem is addressed. I think this refers a little bit to the Ogallala Aquifer. Professor Jim Gecky, out of the University of Nebraska, emeritus now, is a true believer that this pipeline is not a threat to the Ogallala Aquifer. If, in the unlikely event there was a leak, it's not going to move too far. It will be easy to clean up. But as I said at the outset, the first and most important thing to do is prevent it in the first place.
All right. Thank you, Corey Goulet. And we have an audience member here in Calgary, Alberta, who has something you'd like to say. Go ahead.
Well, I would like to know why it's not possible to twin the line that's already existing and take away the aquifer, or go around the aquifer. There's a pipeline there. Why not just twin it and go?
So twinning the pipeline instead of building a new one. Why not, Corey Goulet?
Well, that would have been one of the options that we considered at the outset some 6 years ago. But really, the route we selected was minimizing the environmental impact associated with the pipeline because it was much shorter. The original pipeline was built where it was because it used existing infrastructure, a pipeline that wasn't being used and that could be converted. But the new pipeline couldn't do that. And as such, we took the easiest route and the less environmentally impacted route. In addition, there's an opportunity to bring in crude oil from the Bakken at Baker, Montana. And so we're serving two purposes with this pipeline. One, to move oil sands crude down to the Gulf Coast, but another one to bring 100,000 barrels of crude off the Bakken. And that's important because we're shipping most of that crude by rail today.
All right, thank you very much. And Hari, back to you folks in Nebraska.
So we've got a few comments on Twitter. I'll just read the first one that comes to me here. It says, Marcia White is writing, the chance of polluting the Ogallala Aquifer is too great. There's no way to clean it up once the pipeline leaks. I think that was in response. We're going to take a short break just so that you guys have a chance to stretch your legs and come back. Now you have an idea of how the flow of the conversation is, and hopefully you're engaged enough to get up to the mic, and, you know, we're all friends here. All right, we're going to take about a 3-minute break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Keystone XL Pipeline, an international town hall. I'm joined by a live audience here in Lincoln, Nebraska, one in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and our host there, Donna McElligott of the CBC's Alberta at Noon. Hello, everyone. We want to pick up this conversation about the Keystone XL Pipeline on the subject of economic costs and benefits. In the third part of this program, we'll talk a little bit more about energy security and independence. Donna?
Thanks, Hari. And a lot of people are wondering what the real numbers might be about job creation from this pipeline. And some people here would like to hear from people in the Nebraska audience about what is your estimate in terms of jobs created by the Keystone XL Pipeline.
Who in Nebraska would like to answer that? John, you want to start?
Certainly the figures that I've seen in terms of direct jobs and construction jobs are 2,700 during that initial construction phase, with indirect jobs provided by economic development and activity associated with construction in that 4,400 range. So certainly having a significant impact for those individual construction workers who are breadwinners for their families, and for those 2,700 it is their economic sustenance. That said, I do tend to agree that the real crux of this is not necessarily as a jobs project, but one that certainly promotes a greater degree of economic development for Nebraska, certainly, as opposed to merely just the jobs component.
Are there members of local unions in the audience here in Nebraska that would have an opinion on it? Go ahead. Step up right here to the microphone. And go ahead and identify yourself first.
Good evening, everybody. My name is John Bourne. I'm based in Omaha, Nebraska. I work for the IBW. I'm out of the construction department in Washington, D.C. This is a critical project for us. The amount of jobs is good. A good amount of work comes out of something like this. Not only this, but the ancillary work. TransCanada has done a really good job, even with the first line that they built through. They've already gone back and redone safety stuff and all that, and it provides more jobs. So, as John said, I agree that this is not the Suez Canal. This is not going to change the world by any shape. But I'll tell you what, it's very, very good for construction workers. And it's not just building the pipeline. As John started, he talked about he was with the Southern Power Group. Well, there's a number of utilities that we're going to have to build line to wire these pumping stations. The pumping stations, I understand, are somewhere around 50 miles apart, and let's face it, they're in the middle of nowhere. The problem they have is there's not enough power out there, so there's going to be transmission lines have to be built to this. That's going to provide further amount of work for linemen, transmission people, distribution people, that type of stuff. And not only that, and I'm not an expert in the utility world, I'm a construction electrician, but in the utility world, the amount of power that something like this uses is constant and steady. And that helps the people in the region, that helps the people in the utility district, that helps them keep their power rates lower. It's not that up and down, and as we all know, and the news is over at 10:30 at night, we turn off our TV, we turn off our lights, we go to bed, and that's the end of it. A project like this uses power 24/7, and that will really, really help the utility users in these various utility companies as the line comes down from Canada.
Okay.
I'd like to respond to, and John Bourne's a personal friend of mine. I think he's a great guy. But I'd like to respond to what John Keane said, which is the numbers that you used are significantly higher than the numbers that the State Department came up with in their findings about the number of jobs that would be created. And my recollection is that the numbers were around 1,000 temporary jobs. And actually, there was an article in the Omaha World Herald when the first pipeline was being built, and at that time, TransCanada said that it would be between 800 and 900 jobs. And I understand any job is an important job if it's your job. And if you're like John trying to find jobs for other people, then I respect that, and I'm not going to decry that in any way. I really support that. But as I said earlier, there's more jobs that we can get through energy that will benefit us in the long run, that will benefit the planet in the long run, and I've never heard of a wind spill damaging the aquifer.
Yes, thanks, Hari. We have a couple of panelists who want to weigh in on this because the jobs issue is viewed from a different perspective in this part of the province. Andrew Leach, how would you address this?
I don't know if it's different in this part of the province or different if you're an economics professor, but generally speaking, as economists, we're concerned about a couple of things. One is productivity. And so selling a project on the basis of using more resources to create the same thing is simply backwards from what we should want. From an infrastructure perspective, we'd love to be able to snap our fingers and have a piece of infrastructure there tomorrow, whether it's a wind farm or a pipeline. The fact that we have to devote resources, be they capital or labor resources to it, means we can have fewer of them for every dollar we spend. And so to sell a project based on the costs of building it just seems completely backwards. The other thing that we learn as economics professors is that supply curves tend to slope upwards. So that means prices increase as you draw more quantity. So yes, serving a market with only baseload power is cheaper than serving one with high peaks. However, simply adding more power demand to a regional utility system isn't predicted to have a downward impact on price, at least at this kind of of a scale. So I think we're maybe stretching a little bit on the conventional definitions we'd see from any economics textbook with a couple of those comments.
Can I also ask you about the way it's viewed by some of the unions in this province, though, Andrew? Because workers here see the pipeline as shipping jobs out to refine the bitumen outside of the province. They want it to be refined here. Perhaps talk a bit about that.
So I think the view generally, and I've been often on the other side of these arguments, so I'm probably not the ideal choice for someone to summarize this argument, but I think the basic premise is if we were to build fewer pipelines, what would result would be a discount in the domestic price of bitumen. It would be a depressed price, which then makes the business model of refining that product in Alberta a better business model. And refineries employ people, and in particular, I think a large share of unionized people, so we would have more refineries in Alberta relative, so it would change the distribution of the value in the oil. I think Ed Whittingham referenced earlier, or sorry, Andrew Nikiforuk referenced earlier, acting like an owner and adding value. I think that often gets confounded with distributing rents differently and encouraging processing, and those two are not the same thing.
Corey Goulet, can you speak to how many jobs you believe the construction of the Keystone XL will create in Nebraska?
Sure, I can, and then I'll move on to maybe other economic benefits that this project has beyond the jobs. You know, there's going to be 3 spreads with probably about 1,000 people per spread, and some 5 pump stations in Nebraska. About 100 people work on each pump station. So if you do the quick math, you get up to the numbers, and I haven't even started to talk about engineers and quality folks and safety folks and those type of people who are involved. You get up to the numbers that we're talking about, over 3,000 jobs right in the state of Nebraska alone. Overall, this project's going to have 9,000 jobs in the U.S. and about 2,200 jobs in Canada, direct jobs, construction jobs. And the final supplemental environmental impact statement indicated that if you include indirect jobs as well, this will create some 42,000 jobs. As important, though, is the $3.4 billion of gross domestic product that it'll add to the U.S. And beyond that, the property taxes that will be paid are very important to the counties where this project runs. In Nebraska alone, there'll be over $20 million a year in property taxes paid in the counties there. And in the U.S. As a whole, there's some 27 counties that we run through, and 17 of those will have their property tax revenues increased by more than 10%. And some of those will actually double. It's that significant for those counties. So it's more than just jobs. It's the economic stimulus that it brings. But it does so, and this is to Andrew's comment, it does so efficiently. It is the most efficient way of transporting liquid hydrocarbons. And so you get the double benefit of adding to the economy, but using the most efficient technology to move the energy that's required.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to ask a question to the Canadian audience. You know, we heard actually a couple of different people here talk about how possibly jobs could impact them, how the cost of power could go down. So to the audience in Calgary, do you have examples of sort of how your life has changed for you economically after the pipelines or the refining, or I should say the pipelines in your area have come to be? Anybody in the audience in Canada?
Yes, we have a guest here. How has your life changed because of pipelines?
My name is Mary Knuckleby, and I'm a retired English teacher, so I don't work in the fossil fuel industry. And what oil and gas in Alberta has meant to me in my lifetime is that this is one of the most expensive cities to live in North America. There is a lot of money here for some of the people. And people forget that the GDP, Canadian GDP, oil and gas makes up about 2% of it. But in Alberta, if you're in the oil and gas industry, you make a pretty penny. But there's a lot of us who teach, who work in hospitals, who work in service industries, in care industries. And for us, the major difference is that everything is more expensive. So I think the idea that somewhere these pipelines make billions of dollars that's true, but where that money goes It goes to shareholders. Often it goes out of the country. And so I don't see that for the average person, if they're not in oil and gas, that it doesn't make us rich. In many cases, it means we have greater debt load, especially young people today.
Thank you very much for making that comment. And we have a comment here from Deborah Yedlin in the front row.
So I'd just like to respond to your comment. You said you were a retired English teacher, and your pension fund is invested in the energy sector, which makes up 35% of the Toronto Stock Exchange, and has been a very important part of your retirement fund. So that's how you do benefit from the energy sector. And from a pipeline perspective, I think it's hard to say that we as Albertans benefit directly. We do benefit from the fact that what's produced here is priced on a closer to what is fair value. For the longest time, well, not for the longest time, but we did have an issue where we had a big discount between where Alberta production was being sold at relative to West Texas Intermediate. So that bitumen bubble, which is what we called it for a while, is now, the differentials are narrower. But the other piece to remember is that the production in this, the fact that that differential's narrowed means the government surplus exists, which means there's more money for schools, there's more money for healthcare, and there's more money for infrastructure. So that's the part of the disconnect that seems to be pervasive when it comes to energy production.
There's a couple of people who want to jump in, and a quick response from the original.
Deborah Yedlin is a well-known apologist for the oil and gas industry.
Well,
and
I beg your pardon. Let's keep it on the up and up here.
She's on that side. And
How would you respond to the point she makes rather than the ad hominem comments?
What I would say is that it's a source of some concern to me that my public pension is participating in the total destruction of our boreal forest. The woodland caribou is within a generation of going extinct. Our oil and gas experts blame it on the wolves, but it's actually little islands of extinction that they create between their clear cuts.
All right, thank you very much. And we will get to that part of the discussion in just a moment, but we're talking about how
because our pension funds are invested in oil and gas, help us to get a more diversified economy so that everybody can benefit from a sustainable lifestyle.
Okay, thank you very much for addressing that point. And one quick comment from Andrew Leach, and then back to you, Hari.
Sure. I think the comment does highlight some important aspects. Number one, inflation is higher in Alberta. So saying simply that we earn higher wages is not in and of itself saying we're all benefiting equally from the boom. What is true is that in real after-tax dollars, income growth in Alberta has been faster on average at every single percentile than every other jurisdiction in Canada, except for recent years in Newfoundland. That's real, adjusted for inflation, adjusted for cost of living, however you want to view it. So that part is true. What isn't true, and I think which everyone in the room has to acknowledge, is that those increases are not evenly distributed across the population. And a lot of the view within Alberta is towards that. What share of the revenue should go to profits of the extraction firms? What share should go to government revenues and royalties? What share of those government revenues and royalties should go to today's population versus the future? There are a lot of distributional questions that are on the table. Whether or not you share in, or whether or not you're an apologist for the oil and gas industry, as you incorrectly, I believe, put it, I think you can see that those issues are there.
Hari.
Okay. All right. We were trying to get your attention. We were saying it's rare that America has to fight to get somebody's attention, but thank you very much. We had a comment here. I'm looking back through the cards that some of our audience members have pulled up. Naoma Lane, do you want to come up to the microphone? You had a question about the economics as well? Sorry if I got your name wrong. My name's Hari. I care about these things.
Actually, my question about economics ties into the plans for the oil that is pumped down to further pollute the cities in Texas. The gentleman talked about how it is to enhance the energy situation for the U.S., but we read that a great deal of the oil is to be shipped out of the U.S. So I'm not sure if that's an economics question, but it certainly is a pertinent question.
We would like to go to Greg Stringham from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. He's here with us this evening. He represents an organization that advocates for for energy producers. Greg Stringham, go ahead.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And as we take a look at this, I mean, the oil producers that we have in Canada are looking for their markets. And the United States has been one of the best and biggest markets for us to be able to sell our oil into. To answer the question directly, as long as the U.S. is still importing oil, which it still is to the tune of 7 or 8 million barrels a day, all we're looking to do is displace those imports from other areas and do it in a way that is in a sustainable and a safe way, as you've heard today. So really, when that oil gets sold down into those refineries, it would be displacing oil that has been coming historically from places like Venezuela that had very similar quality oil that was coming into those heavy oil refineries. The real thing that's changed from our perspective is that America has really had a big resurgence in the amount of light oil it's now producing. And that's getting to the point where we're getting closer to this achievable potential goal of energy self-sustainability as it's been going forward. And as we look at that, we still look at the heavy oil that we're producing out of our oil sands, and those refineries have already pre-built, the refineries are already in place. They take that, again, lower value that we've talked about, heavy oil, they convert it into products that they then sell throughout North America and occasionally to South America and other places as well. So the value added is happening, but it's in refineries that have already been built there. It's not to go down and then just be exported beyond.
Greg Stringham, thank you. From CAP, and Ed Whittingham of the Pembina Institute, how would you respond to this point?
Greg, I think you and others raise a really interesting point. And it has to do with where do we want to go as Albertans and as Canadians with our economy. I think without question, sitting here in Calgary, we've all benefited from the oil and gas economy tremendously, not least of which are the wonderful schools and hospitals we have. But to get to Andrew's earlier point, we have this benefit of the debate around pipelines. It's an inflection point to think of where we want to go. To use a Canadianism, we don't want to skate to where the puck is, we want to skate to where the puck is going. And for our Nebraska friends, maybe you can think of a football analogy, go to where the football's going. Now, this week or last week, we had a commission of some of the top CEOs, ex-political leaders, and brightest economists in the world release a report. It's called the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate Change. And it was chaired by Felipe Calderon, the former president of Mexico, that looked at, can we grow our economies in a way that is healthy and sustainable while moving toward this low carbon economy that we need to go to for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which are environmental reasons. And the commission found not only can we do that, but moreover, we can actually have higher rates of growth, healthy, sustained economic growth through going in a low carbon direction than being dependent on the fossil fuel economy. As Albertans, I think we really need to pay attention to that report and really try to digest what it means for us and the future of our economy.
Thank you very much. That's Ed Whittingham from the Pembina Institute. Hari?
Yep, we've got a comment from the audience here as well. Go ahead and identify yourself.
Yeah, hello. My name is Aldo Sewane. I work with Oyate Wahachka Wo'echu, which is an initiative from the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, and we're here in support of the Cowboy Indian Alliance and the work that Bold, Nebraska has done here. I guess, and I'm sorry, Corey, I just don't want to butcher your last name. My last name's kind of hard too, so for me anyway. So I have a couple of quick questions regarding the economy. The first is, as I'm hearing all of the discussion, I'm wondering how a company that can afford to spend $7.4 billion can't figure out how many people exactly are going to be on this pipeline. If you have the top people in your industry, you should be able to give me a number and say, this is how many people are going to be working in this part of the state. And it shouldn't be whimsical. The other issue that I have, and it's a personal issue, is because without those numbers, we don't know how to resolve other issues or create infrastructure. For instance, in Watford City, North Dakota, when we were up there, we noticed that there was an increase in domestic and sexual violence against our Native women. I don't know if you know that, but statistics tell us that 1 in 3 Native women will be sexually assaulted. Now, we saw a 70% increase in domestic violence once the oil fields and those production teams came in to do the labor. is the small communities like the ones that are here. I mean, where we're looking at along the South Dakota, North Nebraska borders, we're looking at there might be one sheriff in that area, particularly in the Gregory community. And we've heard from TransCanada about all the security and whatnot, but what happens to our people that are exposed to that type of violence? Because they can't give us those numbers, because we can't bring in the right infrastructure to provide the safety for our people.
Okay,
We have
so
jurisdictional
your
issues.
question to him is?
My question to him is there's a couple of things. One is, why can't you provide concrete numbers about the labor staff? The other thing that I will put out there now for the opportunity is, we talk about big business, but we're not really talking about our neighbors and what people experience, and how that affects our people, and how do we support that change? If we don't have those concrete numbers, we can't figure that stuff out.
Okay, so concrete numbers, that's
a big one, and the domestic violence issue is a big thing for us.
All right, Corey Goulet, why don't you start with the job numbers first?
Well, I mean, we've been using 9,000 direct jobs for a while. We've done a detailed calculation. I could tell you 9,938 if it means anything more. And we have that broken down by state and another 2,200 jobs in Canada. So we have a project plan that goes through that in detail. We've brought tribe members out to our camps, and we're going to have 4 in Montana and 3 in South Dakota and 1 in northern Nebraska. We brought them out. We've shown them similar facilities to the ones would be built, who's operated by the same contractor that's going to operate ours. We've shown them the security. We've demonstrated how safe they are and the rules that are in place to protect the public, but also make sure that you have a camp that is highly productive. And so I don't have any concerns over the safety of the public associated with these remote locations based on the plan that we have in place and the camp facilities that we plan to build.
Thank you. Hari.
Okay, so we're going to have to kind of move on because we are trying to create a program that will eventually compress into an hour. It's just making their life.
Not a true statement at all.
You're saying that he's lying.
I'll say right now, as a representative of the Rosebud Sioux tribe and the Ocheti Shakowin, the Great Sioux Nation in South Dakota, and along with working with our Ponca and Omaha relatives, no, we have not been consulted, and that's a big issue. And we took that to the State Department, Department of Interior. We have not at any point of this had proper consultation. And even in the EIS statement, you chose the incorrect party to do the Section 106 NAGPRA surveys.
Okay, without getting too far into the jargon, remember there's other...
Right off the point, no, we were not properly consulted.
Okay, all right, thank you. So, Ken, I want to turn the conversation slightly. I mean, are there any circumstances under which you would support the building of a new energy infrastructure? I mean, it seems that oil and gas, or oil and natural gas, aren't going away anytime soon.
Well, this is one of these things where, yes, I would definitely support renewable energy infrastructure.
Are there any circumstances that you would support oil infrastructure?
Well, I think first of all, we need to start thinking about ways of getting away from oil infrastructure, because I think it's as Albert Einstein said, you cannot simultaneously prepare for war and seek peace. And we cannot combat the issues of climate change while we're building more infrastructure for supporting fossil fuels. So there may be it's possible that there would be a situation where we could say, okay, this does make sense, but at the present time, we need to be thinking, rather than thinking about, okay, how are we going to create this project? And I really appreciated the teacher from Canada who got up and spoke about the devastation that's occurring, because nobody's talking about that. I mean, we're talking about total destruction. We're talking about something that's filled with life and killing every little living thing. And nobody's talking about that. And we ought to be talking about that. We ought to be thinking about that. That is not an appropriate way of getting energy. And when there are ways of getting energy that have minimal environmental impacts, that's what we need to be doing. And as the gentleman from the Pembina Institute pointed out, we can have a better economy with cleaner energy. So the answer is in particular, this project is not one that we would ever support. And I agree totally with Aldo. And if anybody wants to talk about prevarications from TransCanada, I've got a long list.
Respectfully, I will say that I think, unfortunately, this debate has created a false dichotomy in the choice between you're either pro-hydrocarbons and pro-fossil fuels or you're pro-renewables. And I think that's a false decision and a false choice that we're presenting to our consumers. Globally, we are still going to be a hydrocarbon-dependent economy globally. They're not going away at any time in the near future. Development of this project in no way precludes the development of renewable resources. It's not as if this is a scarce government resource pool that is funding these projects. So I think as we look first at a public policy process, we have to be rational and reasonable with our electorate and our consumers as presenting them with a real choice and not a false dichotomy. Second, I'm somewhat concerned about the idea that somehow we have to legislate this transition from a hydrocarbon-based economy into one of purely renewables. I'm completely unaware of any large-scale process that took 5 years of international review to examine the fate and future of whether it was the horse and buggy or the steam locomotive. As we increase and improve in technology and our economies adapts to that infrastructure in an economic and reasonable way, they naturally make that progression. And so certainly deciding on an all-of-the-above approach, which looks both at how we improve renewable generation, how we safely deal with a hydrocarbon-based economy and transport that in the safest, most efficient way possible, is only good sense as we transition to whatever our next energy future is going to be.
Okay, Donna?
Hari, we have Andrew Nikiforuk here who will address something that came up just a couple of moments ago about the degradation and the devastation that many people fear are taking place because of the oil sands development and the shipping of bitumen through a pipeline. Andrew, can you respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, the tar sands is an earth destroying project, no doubt about it. It doesn't kill everything in its path, but it is about digging up the boreal forest. It is about creating, massive tailing ponds that are among the world's largest dams. It is about increasing CO2 emissions, and it is a signature of how difficult and extreme hydrocarbons have become. This is not your grandmother's oil. This is not light oil from East Texas. This is stuff you actually have to dilute with light crude or condensate in order to get it to move through a pipeline. This is a product it's a junk crude. It's among the costliest, the most high capital, high risk, high carbon, high water impact and fossil fuel on the planet. And to top it off, it's delivering fewer and fewer energy returns to boot.
Thank you, Andrew. Hari, we have a comment here from Greg Stringham who'd like to respond to what was just said.
Sure, and I respect Andrew's opinion on this, but you've got to take a look at really what's going on with the oil industry as we move forward. We are looking at this being a very, very large resource, and I agree what he says with the development of it. It is higher cost than it is in some other places, but the oil that comes out of this, let's be very fair, is very similar to what's coming out of Bakersfield in California, what's coming out of Venezuela and other places as well. And so we're not trying to push this onto the economy. We're saying that the market can make that decision, and renewables are a big part of that shift. The energy industry gets that. It's all in competition for the development of the oil and gas and renewables and hydro and nuclear that the world is looking for. So we're not pushing this on here. A phrase that I often use in development of this is, Canadians and Americans will decide how much oil they want to use, and we just want to be able to supply that in the best way possible.
Hari, just a quick comment from Andrew Leach, who's eager to get in here, and then we'll go back to you.
We're just about eager to get in on everything. I think there were a bunch of things said that really just don't match up with the data. First of all, obviously the question of oil sands killing everything in its path and killing the entire boreal forest is just way out of scope with what's actually going on and even the size of the resource. But I think more importantly, what this emphasizes, I said it in the outset, is our inability to reconcile environmental damage from the oil sands with production of the resource. And a step forward forward and say, yeah, this is causing environmental damage. Yes, oil sands development in the province will likely lead to the extinction of the woodland caribou within Alberta, along with other things related to industrial development in the province. And that it will lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions and a lot of the things that Andrew Nikiforuk said. Until we as a province can stand up and say, here's legitimately what the consequences are, this is what we're prepared to deal with, but this is why we're doing this, I think we're going to face this kind of objection over and over and over again.
Thank you. Hari?
Corey, we kind of had a question really for you. When you hear these bigger picture concerns about transitioning away from fossil fuels, what does your company think about this? What's the plan going forward?
Well, we understand that we have to move to a less carbon-intensive future. We've spent over $5 billion ourselves investing in wind farms and solar projects and hydro facilities, in nuclear, emissionless energy sources. And we understand that we're going to move that way over time. And I think John talked about the fact that we have to let the technology evolve to the point where it's practical to do so. Having said that, we will continue to use fossil fuels and hydrocarbons for some time to come. The Energy Information Agency indicates that we'll need 7.5 million barrels of imports into the U.S. in 2035. It's a choice of where that's going to come from. Is it going to come from the Canadian oil sands? Or is it going to come from Venezuela, the Middle East, people who don't share our values? They don't have our care for the environment. We have to make sure we have responsible and sustainable development so that we protect our environment. But we can do that and also serve the energy needs of North America.
Thank you.
When we come back, whether or not the KXL pipeline gives the United States more energy security and independence. I'm Hari Sreenivasan, and you're listening to the Keystone XL Pipeline, an international town hall from America Abroad and the CBC in Alberta, Canada. Welcome back to the Keystone XL Pipeline, an international town hall. I'm joined by a live audience here in Lincoln, Nebraska, one in Calgary, Canada, and our co-host there, Donna McElligott of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and the radio program Alberta at Noon. Hello, everyone. So let's start really talking a little bit about energy independence here. And I also want to raise an issue that is near and dear to the folks here in Nebraska, and that is a legal dispute that's going on in this state that's now being reviewed by the state Supreme Court. As I understand it, the lawsuit filed by Nebraska landowners challenges Governor Dave Heinemann's authority in approving the pipeline route in January, saying that it is the Public Service Commission that regulates pipeline routes, not the governor. And I think I have that right, but one of the primary individuals in the lawsuit is actually in our audience. Randy, can you help explain if I didn't get that right, what the lawsuit's about?
Why don't we have Dave Domina, the attorney,
Dave, your attorney?
explain
Sure,
it.
go ahead. What was that?
He's running for Senate.
All right, Dave Domina, you're running for U.S. Senate, is that right?
That's irrelevant to your program, I think, isn't it?
No, but
it's true.
It's just disclosure, that's all.
It's true.
But go ahead.
It is true. So,
and you're also the representative, you're also the lawyer for the landowners in this lawsuit.
Including Randy Thompson, upon whom you called.
Okay.
And I argued the case in the Nebraska Supreme Court when it was heard a few days ago. So the lawsuit in Nebraska challenges the authority of the governor to take action under a specific bill passed by the legislature. We argue that the legislature improperly empowered the governor, not the Public Service Commission, which is a less political body, to make that decision. We also argue that the bill which was passed abuses the public funds of Nebraska by financing the costs that are required to be paid by TransCanada for a study of the pipeline route across this state, and we make several other allegations. At the core of all of that is this series of concerns of the landowners, some of which has come up earlier this evening. First and foremost, nobody here tonight has mentioned the easement terms that would govern the relationship between TransCanada and Nebraskans if this pipeline were built. Those easement terms provide that TransCanada will abandon its pipeline in the land of Nebraskans when it's exhausted. They won't take it out. They won't clean up the mess. The cost of taking it out will be an exponent, and maybe a significant one, of the cost of putting it in, and they would dump that on the people of this state. That easement also sets up a perfect storm in the event of virtually every spill in which a Nebraska landowner has to contest with TransCanada who is at fault for the spill. The cost of the litigation could be prohibitive for the Nebraska landowners. The Nebraska landowners have a hard time appreciating the information from TransCanada, and tonight's conversation illustrates some of that. We've heard before tonight estimates about job creation of 35,000, 25,000, 20,000 jobs. Tonight we hear 9,000 at one point, and later 9,838. This shouldn't be a matter of guesswork. What we're observing there is a controversy in Canada that's largely built on either misunderstanding or misinformation, and we just want the facts.
Okay, thank you very much. Go ahead and step up to the mic if you have a comment. John, you want to respond first?
Well, in terms of, I think, the discussion about how we utilize easements for large infrastructure projects, certainly the process of easement acquisition and even the discussion of eminent domain is always a controversial one anytime we're talking about an infrastructure project. There is a process and a procedure in place. And at the end of the day, we still have to reconcile with any major project what is in the public good and what entitles specific individuals then to essentially have a veto power to stop a project greater than themselves. And that's a discussion which needs to take place in our communities and certainly in the policy process. Unfortunately, the litigation attempt is nothing more than a stop tactic. And we have yet to identify what happens if we just simply say no to everything, and how do we move forward from a policy perspective and an infrastructure perspective on all of these major projects that involve multiple landowners.
Okay. Sir, you identify yourself. Go ahead.
My name is Brad Stevens from Lincoln, and if we're going to talk about the political process about siting the pipeline within the state of Nebraska, I think it's worth talking about the House of Representatives is Republican, has multiple times passed resolutions and measures saying, let's build the pipeline. The majority of governors along the pipeline route across the United States, Republican, support the pipeline. You look at the other side, Democrats like President Bill Clinton, Warren Buffett, labor unions, all support the pipeline. You look at public opinion polling. I've seen north of 70% across the country support the pipeline. I don't know of any other issue that is more bipartisan than building the Keystone XL Pipeline across this country and across this state. So when we start talking about the political process of siting, I don't care if it's the legislature, the governor, a regulatory body like the Nebraska Public Service Commission. Let's stop the political games. Let's stop these lawsuits, and let's just figure out a way to get this project done that the majority of us, Republicans and Democrats, want.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
John Hanson, I'm the president of Nebraska Farmers Union, and we actually represent a substantial number of landowners on this path. And so the previous speaker apparently has very little regard for due process, and that's what this lawsuit is about. It's about the proper use of eminent domain. There is no other power more powerful that the government has unless it's either incarceration or the taking of life than it is the taking of private property without due cause and proper process. And so from the very beginning, we have been under siege in the state of Nebraska as we have tried to develop an appropriate siting and routing process for oil pipelines that is consistent with our other uses of eminent domain and our siting and routing process for other pipelines. And so we have fought TransCanada's dollars as we have tried to develop a fair and balanced approach in the state. They have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars impacting our process, telling us what we can and can't do. Our media lines have been under siege. We have had wall-to-wall media buys telling us sometimes one thing, sometimes if you track their ads, the exact opposite of what they said before. But at the end of the day, for landowners, the reason that landowners are not trusting of TransCanada, and it is a trust question, is that they have simply looked them in the eye, sat down at their kitchen table and lied to them over and over again about simple, easy things that are easy to be able to tell. For example, who's already signed the easement? What about who has the liability when there's a spill? How does the eminent domain process? When widows call me up crying and say, I had to sign because the TransCanada land agents who represent TransCanada and how they operate in our state told her that if she didn't sign the easement and they used eminent domain, she would get nothing. Well, that's a complete, total fabrication. She would get what the eminent domain process would yield. And so
there's a trust issue. That's what
there
you're
is
saying.
a huge trust issue, but going back to the, I hope that you get back to the business of the strategic economic interests of America and where this oil is actually going to go, because we need to talk about the ownership of the tar sands, because the tar sands is going to go where the owners want it to go.
Okay, 2 quick tweets, and I'm going to go back to Canada here. One from Randy Kerr says KXL is part of the answer for U.S. and Canada. We view it differently, but very important. And also, Wael Nasser writes, why does not the oil industry in Alberta call for a carbon tax? We can use the carbon tax revenue to fund research about other energy sources. With those thoughts, Donna, I send it back to you.
Thanks very much, Hari. And of course, I think Corey Goulet is once again on the hot spot. Let's talk about eminent domain, private property, and the assumption of risk. There are huge concerns about these issues in Nebraska.
Well, first of all, we use the process of eminent domain as the kind of tool of last resort, and we pride ourselves in our relationship with landowners. We have 40,000 miles of pipelines in North America and some 60,000 landowners who we view as our partners. We treat them with honesty, fairness, respect. We try to provide them all the information they need to make an informed decision. Most of the time, and certainly more than the industry average, we can reasonably access their land through an easement. They keep ownership of their land. They're allowed to use it for the purposes they had intended before. So eminent domain is that last resort. Right now, we have secured all the land in Montana. We've secured all the land in South Dakota. Because of the reroute in Nebraska, we've secured about 84% of the land. And we continue to work with landowners to find out what their issues are, their concerns are, try to address those, and avoid going to a court of peers to determine what a fair value is for their land.
But to follow up on one of the issues that was just raised as well, pipeline left in the ground and risk assumed by landowner if there is a rupture or a leak.
Well, first of all, we assume the risk of a leak. I think some people confuse a clause in the contract that indicates that the landowner has liability if they hit the pipeline, if they cause a problem. But at the end of the day, we have to clean up whatever the problem is, and we assume all the risk associated with that pipeline in the ground. That's the first thing. The second thing, relative to the abandonment, we're using the abandonment techniques that are allowed through the U.S. Department of State, PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials organization, who dictates how we have to leave the pipeline after we're done. We cap the pipeline, we fill it with nitrogen, we leave it in a state that it doesn't impact the environment. So we're not required to take the pipe out of the ground, and we follow the regulations in that regard.
Thank you. Back to you, Hari.
We have a couple of audience members here. Go ahead, sir. Identify yourself.
Robert Latimer, TransCanada. I'm the KXL project land manager for our acquisition of our land rights for this project in Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska. So our land team takes a very serious approach to each and every single individual that we acquire land rights from. And as Corey said, 84% of those stakeholders in Nebraska we have acquired those agreements with. It's a careful, a deliberate negotiation, discussion, and it's not a one-time kind of visit and we're out of here. Our land team has been around for 2008, 2009 time period working on this. We take it seriously. There's men and women involved in this on our team, and they're professionals. And if anyone is being bullied out there, please talk to me, and I'd be happy to take your concern off air. Thank you.
Randy? I'm sorry, identify yourself.
I guess I have a little issue with what Corey said about using the power of eminent domain as a last resort. If that is true, then why did your company threaten my 92-year-old mother back in 2010 with the use of eminent domain? She received a letter from your company that gave her 30 days to accept your offer, or it said, we will immediately take you to eminent domain court. Now that's been 4 years ago. You do not have a permit now, you did not have one then. So you tell me, explain yourself, please, sir.
Okay, hold on. Before this turns into a Q&A session, I understand that this is an opportunity that you might not have had in the past. But again, we're trying to create an opportunity for the entire country to understand what this is about. And multiple times this evening so far, we're definitely not going to be editing out the fact that there is an issue about trust, that there are farmers who cannot trust TransCanada and vice versa, right? So that's been expressed in multiple ways so far, but without getting into literally the letter written to your mother, which is not a great use of our time, I completely hear what
Actually, I think it is a very important,
sir,
the way that people are treated.
That's totally fine. No. I'm not. I'm just saying that we can't necessarily litigate your specific case, but in the abstract, what you're talking about is that there is, you and others have said that you've had a problem with how it's come across. You've had a problem with the trust. That I think is a better use of having him explain it. But getting back into the weeds of the specific letter, that might not work for the rest of the country. Okay, no problem. I'm just trying to say that I want the rest of the country to understand it, but I don't necessarily.
And I think the rest of the country needs to hear people like Randy Thompson. That's how they'll understand it.
I do know from personal experience involved with siting and issues of utilizing whether it's a easement acquisition process for things such as substations. Even when we're talking about locally elected public power boards talking to neighbors and our ratepayers and consumers when we want to build a transmission line or site a substation, those discussions always become tense. This is property. This is something that we've invested our lives in. And so I think that a respect for the eminent domain process, but also a clear understanding of what it means in the bigger picture is certainly what is called for. And there's no such thing as an eminent domain process or an easement acquisition which is free of emotion. And that happens in every major infrastructure project. How we deal with it long term becomes the bigger question and challenge for all of us.
Okay,
I would like to comment about the eminent domain process that was set out in LB 1161, which is the statute that Dave Domina spoke about. And frankly, I'm going to trust Mr. Domina's knowledge of what is in the easements more than Mr. Goulet's, because Mr. Domina is a lawyer and he's looked at these in detail and he's seen them. He knows what's in there. But also, we're talking about a private company exercising eminent domain for private profit. Generally, when eminent domain is used, it's for public good. It's for when you want to build a road, or as Mr. Keane indicated, if you have a public power district that wants to build a transmission line, because that benefits everybody, as opposed to something where it's going to benefit some shareholders in Canada as opposed to people in Nebraska. And there's a big difference. There's also a big difference. Now, Mr. Stevens indicated that the Constitution of the state of Nebraska is unimportant to him, that we should just ignore it. But if something violates the Constitution and a Republican judge found that it did violate the Constitution, then I believe that the Constitution is very important. And any time one constitutional right is eroded, all of our constitutional rights are eroded.
Okay, so we did. Feel like I'm herding cats here. We did have a goal of talking a little bit about energy independence in this segment, so let's see if Canada can start talking about that. Donna?
All right, thank you, Hari. And there is a lot to cover, but let's talk a bit about this issue. And Andrew Leach, I want to ask you a couple of questions. One is about the so-called ethical oil that comes from Canada, because people who are proponents of developing the oil sands refer to it that way. Some do. And the other question associated with that is there a time from your perspective that the U.S. will not be dependent on oil that comes from Canada?
Well, two-part very different questions. So the ethical oil debate, as we've heard it in Canada, was, I guess, mostly rooted in a book by Canadian, well, I don't know what you'd call him, agent provocateur is probably the best term, author, TV host, Ezra Levant. And the premise of that book is essentially that Canadian oil is the fair trade coffee of oil because it comes from a democratic country and all these other things, which I won't go into. I think obviously there are attributes of Canada's justice system and Canada's rights and such, which I prefer greatly to a lot of other places in the world. I don't think that absolves us of our faults in terms of environmental protection. In fact, I think it actually pushes us to a higher standard in the same way as we expect higher standards from our police in terms of how they deal with people and our court system. We should expect higher standards of how our companies operate within our environment. We're entitled to it. So that's probably my summary and opinion on the debate. In terms of the U.S. and oil independence, I think a lot has been made. Whenever we talk about oil, suddenly Canadians and Americans start talking like we have national oil companies, and we really don't. But when you look at the US projections for U.S. oil, we've heard probably the best summary yet from Greg Stringham, that yes, the U.S. is probably heading towards very near to or surpassing independence on the petroleum products and liquids front, but not on heavy oil. So even though you may have some exports of either light crudes or refined products, you're still going to see a U.S. economy into any projection I've seen, which is importing heavy crudes. So if you're talking about a heavy crude market, whether it comes from Canada or it comes from somewhere else is really the question at hand. And again, going back to Greg's point, you're not going to see someone unloading a boat from Venezuela and reloading it with Canadian heavy and sailing it back out of the Gulf. That just doesn't make economic sense, doesn't make financial sense. Traders will take care of that transaction long before it occurs.
Thank you. And part of the whole equation, of course, are First Nations in Alberta. And getting the oil out, whatever you call it, or the bitumen, requires having several First Nations on board with that. And some have argued that their rights have not been honored the way they would like. Let's just listen in now to a comment from a gentleman who represents First Nations here in the province. And I'm just looking for his name. I'll give you the name right after we listen to what he has to say, because that's the most important part of this.
Well, I think that it's a relationship that historically has been, extremely one-sided and exploitive on the side of the oil sands sector, or the energy sector, rather, working in partnership with a government that didn't have any respect for our fundamental rights.
Okay, can I get the name of that gentleman again? I just want to make sure I'm getting it correct. It's Clayton Thomas Mueller, and he is speaking on behalf of First Nations here, who have big concerns about the way the oil is being developed and their rights in the whole process. Do we have somebody here in this audience who wants to speak to that, and how you feel that Aboriginal rights have been addressed in the whole debate? Let's hear from Ed Whittingham, because he is with the Pembina Institute, and this is something that your organization deals with on a regular basis.
Sure. First off, I want to be clear. I don't pretend to speak for Canada's Aboriginal and Métis peoples. They have powerful voices, and we've just heard from one. What I can say is it's unquestioned right now that we've got many concerns coming from our First Nations and Métis communities with regards to development. And if I link that back to this notion of ethical oil, I think it's the wrong notion. What we need to do, and very including our First Nations and Métis communities, is define what is responsible development. And that's a term that actually my organization, the government of Alberta, and the government of Canada can agree upon. Now, we don't agree yet on the particulars of it, but we need to develop our resources responsibly. And that includes looking at what is the right standard for development. And this notion of ethical oil of a race to the bottom, whereby we're going to compare ourselves to the Nigerias and the Saudi Arabias of the world that have far worse human rights regimes than we do in Canada, I think is the wrong direction to go. Rather, our basis of comparison should be our friends and neighbors in the United States. It should be the United Kingdom. It should be Norway. And hold ourselves to that standard, define it for ourselves as Canadians. What do we think is responsible development? Define that as public interest. And then get to this question of, well, how much impact do we find is acceptable as Canadians? I think the fact that we're having so much rancor and debate right now is symptomatic of we don't have a clear definition of public interest, and we're not believing the messages that we're getting from government, from industry, or even I'd say from environmental groups right now. We need to define that first as Albertans and Canadians, and we haven't created the right forum for doing that yet.
Thank you, Ed Whittingham. Hari.
We've got someone here that wants to make a comment about First Nations.
Yeah, hi. This is Aldo Sewane again, and I wanted to respond to that as well. There's a quote here: "You cannot justify human rights abuse with economic arguments," and that's really true. I heard Mr. Loudermilk, if I said your name right, I'm sorry, or wrong rather, apologize, but I heard him say that you've secured land. According to the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty and 1868 Fort Laramie treaties, all those mineral rights in South Dakota belong to the Great Sioux Nation, and we haven't been properly consulted. I know the Omaha and the Ponca haven't. I talked to Crystal Lehman. I talked to Clayton. We were in a climate march in New York. We're out there fighting for our lives. This isn't just about tar sands. Okay, we keep hearing about crude oil. This is tar sands and the detriment that it can have on our environment and our families and communities. We're looking at the poisoning of our water, the effects of domestic violence. We look at the taking of land. John Harder being one of those men in South Dakota where there has been eminent domain passed.
Okay.
And we look at the culturally and historical areas of significance that there are laws to protect, that TransCanada has not gone through the proper policies and procedures that have been set by the federal government.
Okay, I just wanted to get to you, and then we have one more question for all four of our guests, and we're going to end up finishing out the program. But ma'am, you were standing at the mic.
Yeah, my name is Jill Cool, and just today in the news, they were talking about major universities, and even John D. Rockefeller's heirs are selling their oil interests. They're divesting from oil, coal, and natural gas. It's very clear that it's the thing of the past, and we need to move to the future.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to try to close out the program, maybe looking a bit forward here, and I just want to ask our guests here a relatively simple question. What happens, or what if the KXL pipeline is not built? What would that mean for you? Very briefly, let's start with you, John.
I think in terms of the consequences of a failure to build Keystone XL, there are a number of implications that has on how we shift transportation of crude oil coming from the Bakken and ultimately transporting that oil from tar sands development and the concomitant effects that will have on how we access grain markets and commodity markets via rail. I think we have greater public policy issues in looking at, particularly here in Nebraska, what kind of an image we present to industry, to investors who are looking to site major projects in our state for economic development. And I think it has consequences on ultimately how we address economic development and infrastructure at the local level. How do we go about these processes, and what does this delay say about our ability to really engage in the kind of economic development that we need to do going forward in the coming years?
Ken?
Well, I'd like to point out that Nebraska has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country, and around 4%, and we've managed to do it without having this huge project. And actually, most of the jobs, and as I indicated earlier, I respect the fact that people need jobs, and I'm glad that I get paid to do the work that I do, but only about 100 jobs, from what I've heard, would actually be for Nebraskans. Most of them would be from people who would travel along with the pipeline. So I think that if the pipeline is not approved, and we certainly hope that President Obama does deny the pipeline permit as he's done before, we hope that there's more emphasis, as the president has indicated, that the emphasis goes more toward renewable energy. And there really are more economic opportunities for renewable energy in Nebraska. We have the third best wind resources in the country, and yet our wind development has lagged behind other places. And to contradict what John said, in fact, there's great economic development opportunities from wind development and from renewable energy development. In addition to the direct jobs that they create, it also it attracts businesses. And Iowa has much more wind development than we do. And in the last year, they've had 3 major investments by high-tech businesses of over $1 billion apiece because of the fact that they have so much more renewable energy. Because renewable energy is what companies are seeking out in the future. So we want to see a cleaner economy. We think it will be healthier for us. And I think any decision that's made should not just be considered short-term gain, but what is going to be the impact on our children and grandchildren.
Thank you. Donna, your guests?
Yes, Corey Goulet, what happens if Keystone XL is not built?
Well, maybe a glass half full person, but I believe it'll be built because there's bipartisan support in the United States for the project. But more importantly, the majority of Americans support this project. It doesn't matter what jurisdiction you go into, anywhere from 60% to 80% of folks support this project because they understand the economic benefits of this project. They understand the energy independence that this will bring to North America, and they understand this will be a safe pipeline that won't harm the environment.
And if it's not built?
We'll be relying on rail a little longer.
Andrew Leach, what if Keystone XL isn't built?
Well, I guess thanks for having the last word on this. I think we'll probably see something pretty similar to what happened the last time Keystone XL was turned down. You will see pipelines are a competitive market, and the long-term contracts that shippers provide to pipeline companies are very valuable. So you're going to see other pipeline companies, and I would assume also TransCanada, scrambling to find alternate solutions, not simply throwing up their hands and saying, oh, well, we're there, it's now rail's turn, go ahead and take over. You're going to see existing pipeline applications get pushed harder through the regulatory process. You're going to see new pipeline applications come up. You're going to see oil sands companies working to secure their transportation on other projects. It's going to be a shakeup of that contracting system. I think publicly what that particular project becomes, because it's become so symbolic, it will depend on how symbolic the rejection is. But what I would hope it does is drive us to a conversation, perhaps a more sophisticated conversation on some of the points that Ed Whittingham made. What do we want as Canadians that we can't all of a sudden stand up and say, okay, people will allow us to build pipelines wherever we want. People will take our oil no matter what. There will be a pipeline wherever we want it to go without objection from First Nations as long as we provide enough jobs. And suddenly to see that maybe all of these things are not as true as we thought they were and start to reevaluate some of that. I'd use the term responsible resource development. I think it's the right term, but again, coming to a ground on a definition for that.
Thank you. Hari?
So this concludes the Keystone XL Pipeline and International Town Hall. We'd like to thank our partners to the north, CBC Calgary, and my co-host, Donna McElligott of the radio program Alberta at Noon.
Thank you, Hari. And I'd like to thank my guests tonight, Corey Goulet from TransCanada and Andrew Leach from the University of Alberta, and our studio audience and our distinguished guests who are part of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. And I'd like to thank our guests here in Lincoln, Ken Winson from Nebraska's Sierra Club, John Keane from Nebraska's Public Power District, and our studio audience. The executive producer of this hour is Martha Little. Rob Sachs is the producer. We thank our co-host, the CBC in Calgary, Alberta. Bernard Graham is the executive producer there. We'd like to acknowledge Dave Cochran's technical team for their terrific support. Thanks to NET Nebraska for the technical support and the use of their studios. Thanks to Kim Machia for her public relations work in Nebraska. Also thanks to Fora TV for providing live web streaming of this program. You can hear past programs by subscribing to our podcast on iTunes, finding us on the TuneIn or Public Radio International or America Abroad apps, or by visiting our website, americaabroad.org. I'm Hari Sreenivasan, and this is America Abroad from Public Radio International. Thank you. Support for this show was provided by the Oak Foundation.